So we're going to talk about forage plant growth and grazing management. One of the books I handed out to you today was called Forage Livestock Quotes and Concepts. And I'm going to start each one of my presentations with one of those quotes from this book. This is really a neat little book. It's not heavy reading, so you can sit down at night and just read a couple of these quotes, but they really kind of get to the point of what's important in grazing systems. How many of you have seen this before? Good. Well, I'm glad I brought it today. It's written by Dr. Lacefield, who's my predecessor, Dr. Ball, and Vivian Allen, Carl Hovland, and Joe Boughton, all forage specialists and researchers that are all retired now. So the quote that I wanted to start out with was this one. It's grazing management lessens weather impacts. And we'll talk about that as we go. But how we manage pastures really impacts how drought tolerant those pastures are. Usually the people that are in trouble the worst are the ones that don't have any grass going into that drought or graze their pastures really, really low. So we're going to talk about why that is as we move on. And that's on page 52 if you want to look at that in your guide. A lot of times when we talk about grazing management, we give people tables like this. And if you look in the other book that I gave you, there's a whole table in there that tells you when to start grazing and when to stop grazing and how long to rest your forage plants or pastures between grazing events. And this is great information. But, you know, without an understanding of how forage plants grow, these numbers probably mean very little to most people. And today, one of my objectives is to give you a little bit of an understanding about how forage plants grow, how they respond to grazing, and why these numbers kind of make sense. We're going to talk just a little bit about plant physiology today, and that, of course, is just the vital processes taking place within that plant. We're going to talk a little bit about the morphology of that plant. So how does it grow? Does it grow flat to the ground? Does it grow in a bunch? Does it spread out? Does it have a taproot or a fibrous root system? We're going to talk about all those things today and kind of how they figure into grazing management and how that plant responds to grazing. And then we're going to talk about how those two things interact to determine how we should be managing that plant under grazing. So instead of talking about specific species, we're going to be talking about concepts today, and hopefully you'll be able to apply those concepts to the plants that you have in your area of the country. So I just wanted to start out with the most important biochemical process on Earth, and that's photosynthesis. And essentially, we're taking light energy and converting it into chemical energy in that plant. Pretty amazing process. We take carbon dioxide from the air, water from the soil, and convert it into sugars and carbohydrates in that plant, in oxygen. Of course, the whole process of photosynthesis is much more complex than this. And all this takes place in the chloroplast of the cell. And that's has the chlorophyll that gives the plant their green color. And it's driven from light energy from the sun, the whole process. We have two primary pathways, photosynthetic pathways that we find in our forage plants. We have our C3 pathway. That's how many carbons the first acid in photosynthesis that's fixed in photosynthesis pathway has. And this is our cool season grass pathway. It's better adapted to carrying out photosynthesis at cooler temperatures. We're going to have maximum photosynthesis in the leaf blade of the plant around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. As the temperature gets higher, photosynthesis in cool season grasses tends to be temperature limited. We have something happening called photorespiration in that plant, and that happens at a greater rate as the temperature increases. And that's why cool season grasses tend to be less efficient at carrying out photosynthesis at higher temperatures. And again, because we tend to grow during cooler periods, we have growth from our cool season grasses the most in the spring and in the fall. And we get up to 90 degrees, and our nights stay around 80 degrees during the summertime. Even as we get north in the country, our cool season grasses tend not to grow that much because that is limited by high temperatures. Now our warm season grasses, or our C4 grasses, evolved from our cool season grasses to get around this problem of photorespiration in the plant. And so they're much more efficient at carrying out photosynthesis at high temperatures. In fact, we don't see maximum photosynthesis until we reach around 90 degrees Fahrenheit in our warm season grasses. So what's that tell you? It tells you that they're probably a pretty good fit for the summer months if we can have some of those grasses in our systems. And we'll talk about some of those species later on today as we talk about annuals and as we talk about extending our grazing season and look at a little bit of data on this. They're also more efficient at using water, and that's really important. They'll produce approximately twice as much dry matter per unit of water used during the summer months versus a cool season grass. So if you're irrigating, that's important to understand. If you're irrigating in the summer months and it's hot, you're going to get much more efficient water use if you're using a warm season grass during the summer months. That's also important for non-irrigated systems, because if you're in a rain-fed system and you get 3/4 of an inch of rain, a warm season grass is going to be able to produce a lot of dry matter from that limited amount of water, where a cool season grass might green up a little bit, but it's not going to produce a lot of dry matter. This is a simple design, but my wife likes it, and I didn't need to tell you that I am a horse owner by marriage. So this is just kind of I call it the factory model, and it kind of helps people conceptualize photosynthesis a little bit better. If we think of the plant, you know, in this factory model, our factory is the plant leaf, and it contains the machinery that chloroplasts to carry out photosynthesis. And like any factory, if we're going to produce a product, we've got to have raw materials coming in. Sunlight, water, nutrients, carbon dioxide come into the factory. And then we produce our product, which are sugars and carbohydrates. They can go one of two places. The first place that always gets first billing in a plant is what I call the consumer outlet. That's where the sugars and carbohydrates go for the growth and maintenance of that plant. Only after the growth and maintenance needs of that plant are met do the extra sugars and carbohydrates get shifted into what I call the warehouse or storage in the plant. That's really an important concept to understand. When we rest our pastures, we allow leaf area to accumulate, and we allow the warehouse to be stored up with carbohydrate reserves. CHO stands for carbohydrate reserves in the plant. Why is that important? Well, when they graze that pasture again, and that plant has to regrow and it's got limited leaf area, it will draw on those carbohydrate reserves to grow. If that plant goes through a drought, it's going to draw on those energy sources to regrow. If it goes through winter and goes dormant, it's going to draw on those energy resources to go. So as much as we can, we want to try to keep this warehouse full, or that plant in a positive carbohydrate status, so that it's more robust when it's exposed to challenging situations. Let's talk just a little bit about plant morphology, and that's just the physical structure of the plant. Did you have a question back there? Okay. That's the physical structure of the plant. Some plants have what we call a bunch type growth habit. Things like orchard grass and tall fescue. I brought some of the plants. When they're in a good stand, they look like they're a full stand of grass, but really, as that stand's thin, you can see clumps of grass. When these clumps are close together, it's a solid sod. But really, they're kind of a bunch type growth habit, more erect, upright growth, and kind of grows in clumps. And there, I've got a fescue up here too. And then we have things that are sod formers, like Bermuda grass and Kentucky bluegrass, and somebody mentioned reed canary grass has rhizomes too. And they tend to spread out. And this is, it's a little wilted. I dug it up 2 days ago and had it in the refrigerator. But this is a Bermuda grass sod, and you can see how it's got these structures that grow out, rhizomes. And they kind of fill spaces in the pasture, and it forms a really dense sod in that pasture. And that'll tolerate close and frequent grazing better than, say, a bunch grass would. Let's see what I do with my, oh, here it is. Okay, so we talked a little bit about that. So a little bit about structure of the root systems in plants. Who knows what this plant is? Somebody does, right? Alfalfa, right. This has what we call a taproot system, so it's got one primary root coming down. One of the beautiful things about a taproot system, it tends to penetrate the soil deeper. So alfalfa can find water when other plants can't find water because of its morphology of its root system. Alfalfa is not really an efficient water user. It actually uses a lot of water to produce a pound of dry matter. But it can find water when grass plants can't. Grass plants like a tall fescue and orchard grass tend to have most of their roots, they have a fibrous root system in the upper 10 to 12 inches of soil. So what happens when you get under a drought situation and that upper crust dries out? Not real productive in that type of a situation because one, is the cool season grass, and two, the morphology of its root system is fairly shallow compared to other grasses and legumes. Let me see here. I want to talk a little bit about, I'll just pass these around here and you can look at the root system on there. Don't be afraid to pull in these plants and take a look at them and come up during the break and we can talk more. Mary and I are going to talk more about these plants later this morning. The other structures I wanted to point out was rhizomes and stolons. Those are modified stems of the plant. A stolon grows right above the soil surface. A nice example of a stolon can be found in white clover. And wherever there's a node on this stolon that grows along the soil surface, it can drop a new root system down and a new plant can develop there. So this actually lets this plant spread out. Commonly in pastures of cool season grasses and white clover, you'll see white clover fill those bare areas in within a pasture. And that's because it has the spreading type growth habit. So then we have a example of a rhizome here. Get a nice one here. So this is another example of this is a stolon in Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass can have both stolons and rhizomes. This is a rhizome in Bermuda grass. Again, it spreads out and fills areas in a pasture. The nice thing about a spreading plant like this is that the pastures will tend to repair themselves over time. With a bunch grass, when you damage it, say the soil's wet, and you damage that soil, you actually will get an open space within that pasture because those bunches are kind of limited on how far they can spread out. So we've got a defoliation event taking place here, and this is my wife's horse, and horses are terrible for pastures. They graze so close, and they graze in the same spot over and over again. But they're pretty efficient at defoliation. Just this background photo, I'll tell you just real quick about this background photo. This was taken in Virginia, and the horse had grazed there multiple times. And it started out as a tall fescue pasture, but over time it grazed so close and so frequently that it even killed tall fescue. And what came in that spot is Bermuda grass. Why did Bermuda grass come in there? Anybody know? It's really dense and it grows really close to the soil surface, so it can tolerate that close and frequent grazing. And one of the things I want you to take home today from this seminar is that how we manage pastures really can impact the botanical composition of that pasture. So we can make changes botanically in that pasture just by how we manage grazing, and we'll talk about that as we go on. So we've got a defoliation event here. If we've got enough water and our nutrients are good, what do we need for this pasture plant to regrow with? Any ideas? Oh, you can cheat and look at your thing. I don't care. We need energy. It's anything we do needs energy, and for that plant to regrow, it needs energy, and it comes from two places. It comes from carbohydrate, from leaf area remaining after photosynthesis. So we can look, for example, here, this leaf area is kind of like a solar panel. We can kind of think of that. The more leaf area that we leave after grazing, the quicker that pasture is going to regrow. If we graze it right down to the soil surface, we may not kill the plant, but the regrowth is going to be much slower because it doesn't have any leaf area remaining after grazing. The other place that energy comes from in grasses is stored carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates are stored in different places in different forage plants, and it's important to understand that because that's going to impact how you manage that plant under grazing. So carbohydrates provide energy for persistence and regrowth. Lots of factors impact carbohydrate reserves in the plant, but the one we want to focus on today is defoliation. How does that impact carbohydrate stores in the plant. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. And then this is just to reinforce what we've already talked about. We've got photosynthesis going on. We're making sucrose, a sugar. What always gets first billing in that plant is growth and maintenance of that plant. Only after those growth and maintenance respiration requirements are met does the extra get shifted into storage. So different plants store carbohydrates in different parts of the plant. If we look, for example, at orchard grass or tall fescue, for example, it will tend to store its carbohydrates in the base of the stem, so down here. In the base of the stem is where it's going to store its carbohydrates. What's that mean when we graze an orchard grass pasture really close? What happens to that plant? So remember the two places where energy came from for regrowth, right? Came from where? Storage and leaf area. So we graze this plant really tight. Say I go in there and I'm not paying attention, and I graze it right off like that, right down to the soil surface. What I remove? The solar panel, that leaf area, right? Where's the storing its carbohydrates at? In the stem base. So when I graze it close, I also remove energy from the stem base. So how do you think that orchard grass is going to respond to close and frequent grazing? Not well. That doesn't mean we can't use orchard grass for grazing. It just means we have to manage it a little bit differently. We want to raise our grazing height so that we're leaving the stem base, that we're leaving some leaf area in that pasture so that regrowth will be rapid. If we look at something in contrast like Bermuda grass, it stores its energy reserves in the stolons and rhizomes. Where are the stolons and rhizomes? Right along the ground or right under the ground. The stolons will be right above the ground. The rhizomes will be right underneath the ground. What's that mean in terms of grazing? Well, it'll probably grow back even after the mud, but that means that those storage organs are safely below the grazing height of the animal. So that means that we can graze Bermuda grass a little bit closer than we would orchard grass and still get away with it. In fact, if you look in your book, we recommend grazing Bermuda grass down to a height of 1 to 2 inches versus 4 to 5 inches for orchard grass. And we do that because those storage organs are safely below the grazing height of the animal. So the point of this is know where your carbohydrates are being stored and managed accordingly in that pasture. I'd like to talk about carbohydrate cycling in forage plants, and alfalfa is pretty much the perfect example. Alfalfa stores its carbohydrates in the taproot of the plant. So they're safely below the grazing height. When we mow a field of alfalfa for hay, what's it look like? But there's not much left, is there? There's no leaf area left, right? Just a few inches of stems usually, about 2 inches of stems or so. But it regrows fairly rapidly. Why does it regrow rapidly? Because it's 100% dependent on stored carbohydrates for regrowth. So it's a nice example of carbohydrate cycling in that plant. So what happens when we defoliate an alfalfa plant is that it starts to regrow, and this is the concentration of non-structural carbohydrates in the root. As that starts to regrow, those concentrations decrease very rapidly in that plant. When that plant reaches a height of 6 to 8 inches, what's happening to it? Why are those carbohydrates starting to go back up? That's right. You're getting that critical leaf area where it's meeting the growth and maintenance requirements of that plant, and it's also producing more carbohydrates than are needed for the growth and maintenance, so they're getting stored back up. And by the time we get about 28 to 30 days in the cycle, we're back up to pre-cut levels. What would happen in a forage plant if we let it regrow a little bit, say we get up to 4 or 5 inches, and then we graze it off again? We draw the storage carbohydrates down even lower. It won't kill an alfalfa stand if you do that once or twice, but it's going to make the growth slower, and it's going to weaken that stand, and eventually that stand will die. And that's what we see in continuously stocked pastures. The plants regrow a little bit. As soon as they regrow, we graze them off again. We remove that leaf area. We remove those stored carbohydrates. And those pastures grow back slower and slower and slower and they get weaker and some plants die. And what comes in when you have a dead plant in a pasture? Weeds. The good Lord puts a Band-Aid on that open spot, and usually that Band-Aid's a weed. Sometimes weeds are okay, sometimes they're not so good. What I want you to take away from this is all forage plants have a carbohydrate cycle in them, and that's why we graze and then we rest and we let those plants recover their carbohydrates between grazing events. And the question was at the beginning is, how long should we be resting our pastures? And there's a guide in that book, but really it depends on the time of the year, right? We should be really managing our pastures not by a time period, but by regrowth in that pasture. If we go through our grazing cycle and we come back and that first pasture hasn't regrown because it's been dry, don't graze it because it's been 30 days. You need to feed some hay somewhere. Okay? So we really need to be managing by regrowth rather than time period. So in the spring, when cool season grasses are really rapidly growing, our period between grazing events may be 2 weeks. In the summer, it may be 40 days. You know, so you have to manage with weather in mind, and you have to be flexible in your management, and you have to manage on regrowth rather than time period. Okay, we've got a grass tiller there. This is from a really classical publication by Dr. Roy Blazer. He was at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. Really a man before his time. And he wrote a really great forage management book. And this is one of the diagrams from that. And what Dr. Blazer points out, this is a tall fescue tiller, is that once this collar's present, this leaf is not going to regrow. It's not going to grow anymore. So the question always is what do we do with this leaf? Do we leave it or do we graze it off? And before you answer that, let me show you a couple of tillers. I usually have better tillers than this, but I forgot to pull them before I left yesterday. But this is the collar, and you can pass this around right here. So that means this leaf's not going to regrow. So what should we do with this leaf is the question. We know in our grass plants that most of our nutrients are where? In the leaves, right? So this is a collar. It's the leaf. What should we do with that leaf? First tell me, this is not a trick question, so don't, but what color is that leaf that has the collar showing? It's green. What's green mean? It means it's actively carrying out photosynthesis, right? So if this leaf is actively carrying out photosynthesis, but it's no longer expanding, what's happening to those sugars and carbohydrates? That's right, they're going back down into the plant, and they're helping to fuel growth of that new leaf coming out. The point of this diagram is that we need to leave some leaf area in our pastures. Even though that leaf's not expanding immediately, we need to leave a little bit of leaf area in that pasture to fuel regrowth of that new tiller and new leaf coming out of that tiller. This is probably one of my favorite diagrams in this presentation. It's a little complex, but it really gets at the heart of rotational stocking, and I'm going to kind of break it down. This is again from Dr. Blazer's publication. So if we take this diagram and we break it into two halves. Over here in this half is kind of like a continuously grazed pasture. It has a low carbohydrate reserves in the plant. And we can kind of think about that as every time that plant grows, there's a cow there, and it shoots a little leaf up and it grazes that leaf off, right? So every time that happens over multiple cycles, we're lowering the carbohydrate status of that plant. On this side, we have plants with a high carbohydrate status. That's kind of like a rotationally stocked pasture. So we graze it, we rest it, we let it build its carbohydrates back up. And then we do two other things to these plants. We either leave 2 inches of residual leaf area here, as you can see, or we remove, in the extreme case, all the residual leaf area. And then we look at the regrowth of those plants, and that's on the bottom here. If we look at the regrowth of a plant that had a high carbohydrate status, like a rotationally stocked pasture, and we left 2 inches of leaf area, we get 1 inch of regrowth, and we get almost 4 new tillers formed at the base of that plant. If we go to the other extreme and we looked at a plant that had no leaf area left, and had a low carbohydrate status going into this grazing event, we get half as much regrowth and fewer than half as many tillers formed. So this is really, if you look at one diagram when you go home tonight, look at this one. If you understand this, you understand the whole concept of rotational stocking, resting that pasture, having a high carbohydrate status in that plant, and leaving leaf area. We often talk about, and this kind of gets back to that first quote that I showed you, about what happens on top of the soil. But what goes on underneath the ground is equally important, and we don't really talk enough about that. But what we do to the top of that plant impacts what's happening underneath the soil. And this was a study from Kreider, 1955, so before I was born, 13 years. But still a great study. It's a root growth stoppage study. And what Kreider found was when he removed 50% of the shoots, so say I had a 10 inches of top growth and I removed half of it, then we temporarily, for a very short period, stopped root growth. When we removed 90% of the top of the plant, we stopped root growth for 17 days. When we clipped that plant 3 times a week, so every time it put a little bit of leaf area out and we clipped it off, root growth never resumed. When we removed less than 40% or less of the top of the shoots, root growth didn't stop. What's this tell us? This tells us that what we do to the top of that plant impacts what's underneath the ground. So if we're constantly grazing our pastures, our root system is going to be compromised. It's going to be smaller. What's that mean when we get into dry conditions? Those pastures are going to be much more susceptible to drought stress. And we see that when people switch from a continuous to a rotational stocking system, one of the first things they notice is that their pastures tend to grow longer into a drought stress, and they tend to come out of that drought stress stronger. And that has a lot to do with the root system, and it has a lot to do with the carbohydrate status of that plant going into there. And also how close we graze it. When we leave a little extra residual on that pasture, we don't graze it quite as close, we tend to modify that microclimate at the soil surface, so we tend to get less evapotranspiration from the soil. So this is just a nice diagram from that publication. It kind of sums up the interaction of morphology and physiology in relation to grazing management. If we take, for example, orchard grass, this plant right here, if we have a fairly close grazing height, say 1.5 inches or 1 3/4 inches, how much leaf area is left on that plant? Not too much. And where's orchard grass store its carbohydrates? In the bottom of those stems. So it's not going to do real well under close and frequent grazing because we're removing all of its leaf area and we're removing part of its carbohydrate reserves. In contrast, Bermuda grass stores its carbohydrates in these stolons and rhizomes that are safely below the grazing height of the animal, and it has a lot of leaf area very close to the soil surface. So even when we graze that close, it does fairly well under that close grazing management. So understanding a little bit about how that plant grows, about the morphology and the physiology of that plant, allows us to kind of customize our grazing management to meet the needs of that given plant. This doesn't mean we can't use orchard grass in the grazing system. It just means we need to graze it a little bit higher than 1 3/4 inches in our grazing system. This is another nice diagram, and it illustrates the power of grazing management. When we graze pastures, we can change the botanical composition or the kind of plants that are present in that pasture. And this is an example of alfalfa and orchard grass. So when we tend to graze stand of alfalfa and orchard grass close, we tend to favor the alfalfa in that stand. Why do you think that is? So yeah, so that's exactly right. So he said keep starving the grass. Think about it. The grass needs what to regrow with? Needs leaf area, right, to capture sunlight, and it also uses some of its carbohydrate reserves from the stem base. Alfalfa, on the other hand, if you graze it and rest it, it doesn't mind close grazing because it's getting all of its energy for regrowth from this taproot. So when we graze close and then give that plant a rest, the alfalfa is going to tend to dominate in that mixture. When we raise the grazing height on this mixture, we tend to increase the proportion of the cool season grass or the orchard grass in that mixed stand, because we're putting that grass in a more favorable position. So how we graze a pasture really impacts what plant species are dominant in that pasture. If we want to increase, say we had a mixture of tall fescue, I don't know what happened to my tall fescue plant, in Bermuda grass, if we graze that pasture tight in the summertime, which one of those species do you think is going to dominate in that mixture? We're going to shift that botanical composition towards the Bermuda grass in that mixture. And we can manage fertility too to help shift botanical composition of pastures. Grazing management is really a powerful tool if you understand how the forage plants grow and which forage plants you want to favor within that mixture. So just a little bit on rotational grazing. Again, we're leaving a residual, we're managing residual leaf area, how much leaf area is left after grazing. A lot of times we give you recommendations like cows can follow them, and they're going to go in and they're going to graze every plant in that pasture down to 4 to 5 inches, and we're going to rotate out. It doesn't work like that in the real world, of course. Some plants are going to graze, some plants are not going to graze. But generally speaking, when they start to graze, when the shortest grass in the pasture gets to the target height, we need to think about moving those animals to another pasture. And if we have some plants that didn't graze, then maybe we come back in and clip those. We want to leave plenty of leaf area. And then resting allows us to manage those carbohydrate reserves in that plant, allows them to replenish those carbohydrate reserves, and then maintain botanical composition. And ideally in our cool season pastures, we want about 25 to 30% legumes if we can get there. So that's it for this section. Is there any questions on forage plant growth? Yeah. Yeah.
I've seen this very dramatically drought now, perhaps say waterway, where there's red clover with it, big and dark green, and where the anhydrous, pointer of it came over into the waterway. So, in earlier years, my understanding was that the grass were getting nice. Confirmed with the way we grow. Then I've read that, it's fixed, after the nitrogen relating, that's only available to legumes growing, not the grass growing next to it. So my question is the nitrogen that the grass is getting from the legumes coming from roots of plants that died earlier in the season or previous season, or is it actually current extracted nitrogen from
So generally speaking, so when we have say a grass plant and a legume plant growing together, there's no or very limited direct sharing between the grass plant and the legume. I know I need to get off the stage here. So a lot of that cycling comes through the animal when we introduce that animal in the system. So the animal ingests the leaves of the clover or the leaves of the alfalfa and urinates and defecates in that pasture, and we build a nitrogen cycle up. These nutrient cycles don't happen overnight, and that's one of the points I want to make is it takes 3 to 5 years to really start to improve the soil and build this nitrogen cycle within the soil. There is some leakage of nitrogen from legume plants that the grass plants can grab, and there may be some direct transfer through mycorrhizae, but that's kind of a new research topic area. But most of it comes through nodules that die on the legume plant, roots that die off of the legume plant and release nitrogen into that soil.
Once you graze the legume, part of the nodule, and the term I haven't heard you before.
Well, yeah, I guess you could say aborted.
Some nodules.
Whenever you graze a plant, you're going to get some root dieback on it usually. And that root dieback will release whatever's in the roots into the soil, and then the other plants can use it. It's probably not quite that that simple, you know, if you have good soil health and you have lots of microbes in the soil and lots of things breaking those decaying roots down, that tends to speed up that release of nutrients in the soil. But it's not like putting a bag of nitrogen on the pasture, per se.
It takes a solid 3 years
Yeah,
to start getting
this nutrient cycling to happen in the soil.